Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program. My name is Kaylor Sweeney, and I serve as the Common Ground Initiative Program Manager at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley State University. Before we begin, I would be remiss if I did not thank those whose work and support made tonight's event possible. First, thank you to Brooke Oosterman of Housing Next for partnering on this event. Additionally, I want to recognize my colleagues at the Hauenstein Center, as well as Grand Valley's facilities, information technology, catering and event services staff, and others whose work behind the scenes ensures a successful event. And finally, thank you to our Hauenstein Center members, whose ongoing support allows us to endeavor on our mission of raising a community of ethical and effective leaders for the 21st century. As many of you know, a key component of the Hauenstein Center's programming is the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. Every year, a cohort of student leaders joins us for a unique leadership development experience. At each event, we invite one of the fellow candidates to present a leadership minute, a brief reflection on their personal leadership journey. It is my privilege to introduce to you CLA fellow candidate Esri Sutter to share her leadership minute and introduce our moderator for the evening. Esri is completing her third and final year at Grand Valley State University. She is double majoring in psychology and criminal justice with a minor in applied statistics. She plans to continue her education at the University of Michigan, where she will be completing her Master's of Social Work. On campus, Esri works as a tour guide for incoming students, is in Psi Key, the International Honor Society for Psychology, and spent last semester assisting Michigan State Police in cold case investigations. Esri has worked as an intern at the Grand Rapids Police Department for both the front desk and for the Victim Services Unit, and currently working with the Homeless Outreach Team. She enjoys volunteering in the Grand Rapids area with the Children's Advocacy Center of Kent County, Mill Trotter Ministries, and the YWCA as an advocate in both the Nurse Examiner Program and in the Child Care and Domestic Violence Program. She looks forward to exemplifying leadership through service and social work with the criminal justice system. Please join me in welcoming Esri. Thank you for being here tonight.
Hi everyone, my name is Esri Sutter, and I'm a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate. This is my first year in the Cook Leadership Academy, but I've already learned so many valuable lessons about leadership. Leadership is not always just about who can run a company or who can lead a team, but instead, I believe it is someone who has the ability to make people feel heard, seen, and valued. I have a friend right now who is struggling to find affordable housing. For the time being, she's living on the streets of Grand Rapids or is staying in a homeless shelter, just looking for a good cup of coffee. My friend and I are similar in so many ways. We both care for others, we speak our minds, and we talk to others, and really enjoy that. However, because of our living situations, strangers view us very differently. When I speak up for what I believe in is wrong, my concerns are seen and validated. When my friend speaks up for what she believes to be wrong, she's met with a cold shoulder and no solution. When I approach people to strike up a conversation, I am met with awkward small talk, of course, but nevertheless, the person is usually willing to converse with me. When my friend tries to talk to people, she's met with disgusted glares or avoided eye contact. I give these examples because our situations do not define who we are, but they may define how people treat us. So today, I encourage you, as leaders in this room, to consider those whose voices are not heard on stages such as these, voices who may be embedded in our communities, but whose voices are otherwise unwilling to be heard. Many people often say that we are giving voices to the voiceless. As I was writing my personal statement for graduate school, a mentor in my life advised me of how harmful this language can be, because they do have voices, but they are tuned out by those who need to hear them. As a leader, I am committed to elevating these voices to politicians, city administrators, business owners, and to the general public who hold the power to make a difference. Helen Keller once said, "Alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much." Creating a more equitable community takes action, whether it is volunteering in your community, striking up a conversation, or simply just smiling at someone who is used to receiving avoided glances. I urge you to take an action step towards fostering a more inclusive and loving community for those who are unable to call four walls a home. My name is Esri Sutter, and I'm a leader. I now have the pleasure of introducing Brooke Oosterman, the moderator for tonight's panel. Brooke Oosterman joined Housing Next as the Director of Policy and Communications to support the expansion into Kent County. Brooke's extensive experience in economic development, policy advocacy, and business support have centered around community development. Since joining the organization, she has led on cross-sector partnerships to move housing supplies solution forward. This work has included policy advocacy, community will building, new tool creation, and communication strategy. Brooke received her degree from Michigan State University with a BA in public policy. Please join me in welcoming Brooke to the stage.
So I just want to say thank you to the Hauenstein Center and for the amazing introduction. What we're here to talk about today is action and how each of you can be a part of solutions for housing here regionally and in Kent County specifically. As mentioned, my name is Brooke Oosterman. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications for a regional partnership called Housing Next. We work with developers, municipalities, nonprofit developers, for-profit developers, and community grassroots advocates to move housing supply solutions forward. So I'm going to provide just a little bit of information to kind of set us a baseline for our conversation this evening. We base our work on housing needs assessments. So we identify what the demand is in the community, what those population demographics are who are in need of housing, and we use that as a basis for policy solutions and community organizing efforts. So I'd like to just share with you as a group kind of that information. This is brand new information, results of a 2022 housing needs assessment that we're beginning to share out publicly with the community. So this looks like a big number, and it is 35,000. What I want to just quickly share with you is that we did an original housing needs assessment back in 2020. Since then, some significant things have happened in the world and in the housing market. And so we did an updated housing needs assessment for Kent County to assess where our demand is. So we know that we now are nearly 35,000 units short of what the projected demand will be over the next 5 years. That's across the rental and for sale market, and that's across all price points. We also know that we have seen an immense increase in price to the tune of 99.2% since 2016 in this community. Something that I want to highlight is that the two largest price increases came over the last 2 years in the city of Grand Rapids and Kent County. So this is compounding on top of already an incredibly high demand for housing. So as I mentioned, what was a 22,000 unit shortage just 2 years ago is now 35,000 units and climbing. We know that that represents a 59% increase in the city of Grand Rapids and a 54% increase in the rest of the county. I want to highlight here, I mentioned that we are a regional partnership, so we support housing supply solutions in both Ottawa and Kent County currently. So this is showing what that overall demand looks like. So you'll see market rate housing, you'll see term attainable housing, and you'll see affordable housing. Affordable housing is for households who are making lower income. Attainable is more what we call workforce development housing, or folks who kind of fall in the middle. They can't afford what the market is costing, but they also don't traditionally qualify for subsidized housing. You'll see this represents really what we're looking at. We're not looking at just that 35,000 unit shortage, but in fact, regionally a 49,000 unit shortage that we are trying to combat. And we are looking at a multitude of solutions, given that we have an immense need at each part of the spectrum, but specifically a very high demand and increasing demand in that missing middle housing typology. So why do we care? Why is everyone here, right? We all care about housing because everyone needs housing. We know that it has a direct impact on student outcomes, on health outcomes, on our ability to create wealth building opportunities for those traditionally marginalized. We know that it impacts our ability to attract and retain top talent. And so we all have a vested interest as a community because what we desire most about our community is directly impacted by housing. Another important thing that I want to highlight about housing is that we have a significant portion of our population that is cost burdened, or they are spending 30%, they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. We also have a significant percentage of the population who is severely cost burdened, meaning they are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. Another important fact of why we care about this as a community is because we know that renters are disproportionately cost burdened. We also know that disproportionately renters are households of color. And so we see how that has had an impact in our community in access to homeownership and generational wealth building. So this is that 35,000 unit shortage broken down. So we analyze this based on rental versus for sale, as well as our wage and salary, or our AMI, area median income. So you'll see here a couple of things I want to highlight. I want to highlight that you'll see the largest gap in rental is that missing middle I'm talking about here. So the 50 to 120% AMI. And you'll see that there is large growth as well, over half of all demand in for sale. So that is a critical space that the market cannot provide housing for, but it is being severely demanded. And you'll see also that those folks are making significant salaries. They're being paid well. They're nurses, they're teachers, they're folks that we are not allowing to live in our communities. And then another number I want to highlight on the far left, you'll see for sale units needed. You'll see a very low number, 100 units. That number, I just want to clarify, does not suggest that we only need 100 houses for sale in this community, but rather it reflects the amount of folks who make less than 30% of the area median income and qualify for a mortgage. Very small percentage of the population. So some people see that number and say, great, let's solve the challenge. It's a little bit deeper than that. And so we see high income earners also increasing in the community and that having an impact on the market as well. So this broken down shows you the number of households that fit in exactly those spaces that I was talking about. You'll see that our largest gap is in that attainable housing space. And then our second largest is the market rate housing. And then our third is the affordable housing. Something before we move past this slide that I want to highlight, a great point that was made earlier, is that even though we see the breakdown here and see that affordable housing, we have less households in need of that 6,400 number is the number of households. So that is the number of individuals who have no other options in the community and are being priced out of opportunities because of the rest of the spectrum. Something else that I want to highlight, we have been doing an incredible job in Kent County. We kept building over the last 2 years. A lot of communities didn't. We permitted over nearly 5,000 units in Kent County alone over the last 2 years across multifamily and for sale. So I want to applaud the efforts by the folks in this room, municipality leaders across the region, as well as developers and our elected officials. But I also want to highlight that when we're only permitting 5,000 units every 2 years, and we have a gap of 35,000 units, we have a long way to go. Why are we in this predicament? Why do we have this critical housing challenge? Our housing needs assessment shows it is largely due to population growth. We have continued to outpace the state in population growth and are projected to continue to do so. And in fact, we continue to grow as the state will see overall population decline. We also see this combined with the household growth number exceeding the state. And so we have new households forming on top of the population growth. So I just want to share this quote by Mayor Rosalind Bliss. We are proud of the growth happening here in Grand Rapids and have made it a priority to support all current and future residents by advancing meaningful housing solutions. Ensuring everyone has stable and desirable housing will also help address critical quality of life and equity outcomes in Grand Rapids. So that's what we're working towards. What does that mean? What else does the data tell us? It tells us that just in the city of Grand Rapids alone, we need over 14,000 units in the next 5 years. That's broken down pretty evenly between rental and for sale markets here in the city. We do see, again, that greatest rental gap for the city of Grand Rapids is actually higher income earners. And then we also saw that greatest increase for the city of Grand Rapids. Again, I mentioned 2021, an increase of 18.4%. In Kent County, that number is over 20,000 units short. We know that in the county as a whole, we have nearly zero vacancy in affordable rental options. We have seen a reduction in overall percentage of the population that is cost burdened. So spending 30% or more of their income on housing, that's a really good thing. But I also want to share that that is also probably being driven by the fact that we are bringing higher income earners into the community. And so while we should be proud of that, we also, again, have a lot of work to do. So we have our rapid growth in for sale of over $100,000 or more, and we're seeing rents escalate quickly, especially for market rates. Housing stock below, that's no surprise to anyone in this room, below 200,000 has all but diminished completely. And then Kent County, the highest increase in prices came just last year at 15.7%. So I talk about the issue, right? I say, what are we combating? What is our mission? In addition to that, our mission is to provide solutions. Our mission is to bring every community in the region together to find cross-sector solutions to the housing challenges. The good news is that we have already begun this work in a very big way here locally in Kent County. The Kent County Homes Fund, a gap financing program that offers low interest rates to combat some of the increases in construction costs and interest rates that have plagued development over the last 2 years. That was invested in to the tune of $17.5 million by Kent County through an ARPA allocation. That has a $58.3 million impact because they chose to do that through a community development financing institution that leverages private dollars as well. The city of Grand Rapids made a similar allocation, and then we're also seeing the local community invest in grant support for local municipalities who want to make some of the changes that you'll hear about this evening. I also want to highlight some of our incredible folks in the communities that we work. You'll hear from the City of Wyoming on our panel, but these folks are already making efforts to be a part of the housing solution, and they're doing so right now, and what they need from all of us is the ability to accelerate that work. We also are seeing, from a state perspective, some additional tools that are being passed by the legislature to ensure that our developers and municipalities have ongoing tools to support continued development. So we know that the need is there, we know that the demand is there, and we know that the will is there. We've seen the local community show up to support housing solutions. So what do we need? We need all of you in this room to listen with open ears this afternoon, this evening, and be a part of the housing solutions that we're working on. We need you to show up to your community meetings and say that you want more housing, that you're not afraid of new neighbors, and that you open your arms willingly and welcome them into your neighborhood. This full housing needs assessment, I will share. It's available to you publicly on our website at housingnext.org. It is 172 pages long. So I am here as a resource to help you sort through that data and help you to address your community needs specifically. And of course, I can be reached directly at brooke@housingnext.org. So with that, I want to take no more of your time to go over this. I wanted to set a foundation, but we have an incredible panel here this evening. So I'm going to welcome them up to the stage and read their bios so that you can get a little more familiar with them. So Shane Phillips is a researcher, public speaker, and consultant on housing policy and affordability issues. He manages the housing initiative within the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, focusing on research, policy analysis, and education. He co-hosts the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and he's the author of The Affordable City, published in 2020, which advocates for a three-pronged approach to solving the housing crisis: supply, stability, and subsidies. Nicole Hofert is the Director of Community and Economic Development for the City of Wyoming here in Michigan, where she manages planning and development projects as well as several resident boards and commissions. Since joining the city in 2018, she has been instrumental in bringing community members together to help develop Wyoming Reimagined, the city's new master plan. Before her work in Wyoming, she was a private sector planner advising municipalities on comprehensive and master planning after graduating from the London School of Economics with a master's degree in city design. Jeremy DeRoo joins us as the CEO of Dwelling Place, a nonprofit developer here in Grand Rapids. He's a proud graduate of Calvin and GVSU. He and his wife Heidi share a love of international travel and 4 beautiful children. Jeremy started his career in nonprofit housing development with Link Up, where during his tenure he was promoted from housing coordinator to operations director and eventually to executive director. In his career, Jeremy has helped secure more than $100 million in community development and affordable housing funds, impacting thousands of families here in Grand Rapids and beyond. So I'm going to get us started. I shared a couple of numbers. They're really big numbers, right? Nearly 35,000 units just in Kent County alone. Nearly 49,000 units regionally. Each of you have unique experiences to help us kind of walk through why those challenges exist and how we can move forward. So I want to start with something that I pulled out from your book, Shane, The Affordable City, which is for sale out front, and he will be signing. Got to make a plug.
I'm not going to do it.
So in your book, you shared a perspective that stuck with me. Resilient communities can and must continue to evolve. Those focused on preserving the present will be poorly adapted to the future. So if you could share with me your insight on that specifically, what are some assumptions we should be making about what adapting to the future looks like, and maybe a little bit on what some of the difficulties of how we adapt to that in the real world,
Sure.
From your perspective?
So I guess the first thing to say maybe is that, from what I've observed from cities all over the country, and especially cities that have, high demand, a lot of people who want to live there, want to stay there, want to move there, is you really have to make a choice. The demand is going to be there whether you build housing or not, whether you adapt to it or not. It's just a question of how that demand manifests. So either you provide housing for the people who want to move there, and you can kind of soak up some of that demand and prevent some of the problems that come from a shortage of housing, or you can kind of bury your head in the sand and not do that. And prices are going to be the thing that goes up instead of more homes. And so that's really the crux of it on the supply side. I think we'll probably come back to this, but I think thinking of this in terms of opportunity is a really important approach, and just recognizing that whatever goals that you have, they are probably served by being more welcoming of homes, in particular homes in more kind of infill areas like the downtown and surrounding neighborhoods, whether that's improving environmental sustainability, giving people more options for getting around that don't require driving for an hour, giving people better access to opportunity because central areas tend to have more access to jobs and good educational opportunities like this one, and so on and so forth. And so I think those are a few things to think about, and I said I'm going to be much more brief now than I was in the afternoon.
I want to highlight something that you said. So earlier at lunch, Shane, I think, reframed this like you just did. So we talk about 35,000 units, right? We talk about all the families that represent. That feels very overwhelming, right? It's really big. It really starts from a place of like, we have a problem, how do we solve it, right? Which is important. But I think to Shane's point, looking at housing and our demand for housing as an opportunity, it's a good thing that people want to live here. It's a good thing that people want to move here, stay here, raise their families here, come back here, whatever it is. And so we really have in front of us an opportunity to be a part of something really positive.
When you have a lot of demand, you have options for how to respond to that. When you don't have a lot of demand and people are leaving and don't want to come back, there's not much you can do.
Right.
And so, count your blessings.
A good problem to have, problem to have. So something that I want to just highlight, we have various stakeholders here, right? And so we're going to touch later in the program on how every one of you can show up and be a part of Housing Solutions. But just if the panel could, kind of share what you think developers, politicians, planners, our nonprofit community, right? What are kind of the responsibilities and the opportunities for folks across various sectors to be a part of the housing solutions?
Should I go first?
Whoever wants to go first, go for it.
I guess since mine's very general, I'll say, and this relates to my book, so supply, stability, subsidy is sort of the theme of the book, prioritizing those three different things. And really that comes down to building enough homes, protecting people in their homes, especially more vulnerable households, and subsidizing housing for people who, for one reason or another, temporarily or permanently are not going to be able to support themselves fully. And what I really push for is for people to recognize how intertwined all of those goals are, and really how even if your focus is supply or stability or subsidy, it's perfectly fine to prioritize one of those things in your own work, in your own advocacy, but to recognize that if you are going to push for supply solutions, you need to be aware of the impact that's going to have on vulnerable and marginalized communities, the potential it has to displace people. And similarly with tenant protections of various kinds, you need to be aware that those can actually undermine supply efforts if they're designed poorly. And when you actually do take that into consideration and consider, okay, I really care about housing supply, I want to do things to improve it, increase it, you need to work with people kind of across the aisle, if you will, tenant advocates, for example, to figure out how do we achieve this goal in a way that doesn't undermine your goals, and vice versa. And so I think that's something I'm constantly pushing for. And everyone, whether you're an architect, an affordable or market rate housing developer, a tenant advocate, what have you, an elected official, we all have a role to play and something to contribute in that conversation.
Yeah, I would say that as a municipal planner, the one thing that I think is really important is that people educate themselves and they understand the issues. Housing touches everyone. everyone has that moment where they, if you were lucky enough to buy your first house, you think about that and the feeling of that. As you grow and you have children, you think about, well, where are they going to live? Maybe they got their first apartment and you help them move into that apartment. If you have, maybe it's time for you to retire and you're thinking about wanting a smaller home, a smaller yard, less work. And so throughout your life stages, housing touches everyone. And housing can also be scary. Change can be scary. And like Shane's talked about, if you aren't proactive and you don't think about a different future, you can almost become stagnant as a city. And so when we talk to our residents, when we talk to the community, we talk about how housing is not just for one person. It's for the teacher who's making $55,000 and can't find somewhere to live. It's for the nurses, it's for the firefighters, the police officers. There's a spectrum of individuals who all rely on housing. And so we have to be humans when we talk about it. It can be intimidating to hear that an apartment or a multifamily unit is coming near your home or into your neighborhood. But trust that your community has worked on a master plan, that they've talked to people about this, that we've worked with Brooke and others to understand what the housing needs are, and that those recommendations and the developers coming forward are trying to help solve this global problem that we're experiencing.
Agree with everything that's said there, right? I think housing, the amount of housing supplied at a community level is a choice that communities make, right? The amount of housing, the affordability points, how much housing is affordable to which people is a result of choice. There's a lot of choices by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, but ultimately, as a community, we have the ability to choose how many people are not housed at all every night. It is a choice that we can make as a community to address these issues or not. It is done through the master planning process, right? Our master planning process decides how many people get to live where in our cities, and they're really, really important. And so it's really important as a community that we pay attention to those, and as those opportunities come up, we all speak into that. I think the ability to build homes, it's expensive, it takes a lot of money, but we also need to make sure that we are intentional about encouraging people to go into the trades and make sure that we are creating a workforce that's capable of building the homes that we need, and are looking at that and lifting up and celebrating the people who are doing that type of work, and making sure we don't disparage that and discourage people from going into that, because that also speaks into these theses. There's a lot of different ways in which we can contribute to increasing housing supply in our communities and making sure that we have enough houses for everyone. And it's never just one choice, but it is a choice as a community that we get to make.
I think in your book too, Shane, you do mention that, right? We always talk about housing supply as purely housing supply, and you brought up the supply of workers and how that does have a direct impact on overall ability to move solutions forward. Something else that was shared, and I promised this young person I would share this tonight, that I met at lunch this afternoon, a Grand Valley State University student who is studying statistics. So I'm going back to Nicole's point of who this is impacting, right? She said, I love Grand Rapids, I want to stay here, but I can't find housing. So I'm moving back in with my parents. I'm moving back to the east side of the state. I can't find anything here. But my hope is that when I finish my grad program there, I can come back. So she gave me a timeline of 1 year to figure it out. So you all are helping me with that. But that's what we're talking about, right? It's a diverse set of folks who we have done an incredible job as a community of making sure that we are intentional about how we grow, and that we're creating great opportunities, educating them at great institutions. But then we have a barrier to being able to retain that talent and have their expertise used to make our community continually better. So something that I also want to highlight, you had talked about some of the tension between supply, subsidy, stability. One of the things, I shared this number earlier, we got this number fresh today. So if we were to just talk about, we recognize that supply is not enough, right? Supply alone is a critical part, but that it's a more long-term solution, right? It takes time to build homes. It takes time to finance homes. It takes time to get them through the approval process. We have folks who are struggling right now, right? But if we were to look at how much money, let's say we could wave our magic wand and say, federal government, we need all this money to fix our housing challenge. Just here, right, just in our community, that would require $4.2 billion, right? And that number,
To build those 35,000 homes or
Yes.
subsidize one part of them?
so if we were to minimally get to that point, but if we wanted to ensure that there was affordability built into that, right, it would actually cost $12.7 billion. So that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about subsidizing is not feasible
At that scale.
at that
Yeah.
scale, right? But we recognize that that is a critical component, and as a community, we need to work towards how that plays into our overall strategy. I want to highlight too, Housing Kent. We've got, you can raise your hands, woot woot or something. We have great partners in Housing Kent in this community who are working on those critical issues of subsidy and stability. And so I'm really proud, as I read the book and prepared for the conversation today, that we have a lot of things already happening in this community in partnerships and collaborations across those stakeholders. So I want to point a couple questions at you all, right? So it's a really big challenge. We know it's a national challenge. We know that we're growing here. We know that there are statewide changes, maybe Shane, that you can touch on, that you've seen work. We also know that there are local level levers that we can pull to help, right? We know that we have within our control, some of them were already mentioned through zoning. So let's start off with Jeremy. Cost of construction, right?
Yep.
It has increased over the last 2 years. Supply challenges, labor challenges, interest rates, all of those things have impacted it. And so could you walk us through how some of those costs have changed and have impacted your ability to bring new units online, and maybe also why you would be interested in being a part of zoning reform conversations or local solutions around gap financing, what we can do to help you with those increased costs as a developer?
Yeah, right. I mean, the short answer is costs have gone up, right? Like it just costs more to do everything now than it used to. Construction costs were some of the early pieces that went up in the inflationary market that we're in right now. They went up early and they have not come down and probably are not coming down anytime soon. They may level off, but they just cost more, right? When we are looking at building homes for sale to low-income families, historically, kind of in 2000 and let's say 15, it was about a $75,000 to $100,000 subsidy that it took between the cost of developing a house, having it ready in the market, and then being able to sell it to a low-income family. That number has probably gone up to about $150,000 to $175,000 now because of a combination of increasing construction costs and then increase in interest rates, right? So as interest rates go up, the ability that really impacts low-income families particularly, because obviously your mortgage costs more. And then the flip side, the construction costs are going up. So that gap between what it takes to move a family into home ownership is going up significantly over the last few years. And the same thing is on the rental side. Again, that's the same levers are in different ways, right? Your construction costs of building the homes go up, but your cost of the mortgage on the back end also goes up, which just makes it less and less affordable. The other piece that we don't really think about as much in terms of impacting affordable housing delivery is in a high inflation market, it really, really impacts low-income housing because our costs go up the same way everybody else has done. You might have a 9% increase in inflation last year, right, or an 8% increase in inflation, but low-income families' income increases do not match inflation. They're always going to be lower than the inflationary market. So when we are talking, that means our rents do not go up with inflation. So as we look at trying to figure out, and we build homes with a 15, 20-year horizon on it, right? So we need to say, if we're building a house now, how do we keep this a house affordable for 15 years? When we have to expect that costs are going to go up 6% a year and income will only go up 3% a year, it's really hard to make something work for 15 years. And so that really impacts the ability. You need even more subsidies in the front end to make sure that can stay affordable in the long term. And that is actually the way math and algebra work. That's a very big difference when you have that type of difference between your income and expenses on that side over a long period of time.
And I would say too, when we're talking about the supply side of things, right? So you threw out the cost increase. We know that new construction is now nearly $400,000 here in this community. So when we talk about building our way out of this, right, we have some opportunities to do that in a less expensive way, either with subsidy or with zoning reform that maybe allows for smaller lot sizes, smaller unit sizes. We have the ability to get creative, but we are not going to build our way out of it and we're not going to subsidize our way out of it. So we need those things to be aligned in this community for us to move forward. So Nicole, if you could walk us through, so we hear a lot about zoning, right? We know that zoning has a history of exclusion. We know that zoning is also a local tool that we have, right? We know that we can use that as an opportunity to say what's important to us as a community, and many communities are doing that around our region, including the City of Wyoming. So can you walk us through how you have really walked the community through zoning reform and use zoning as a tool for housing solutions? And then you know what my follow-up question will be, which is, what else do you need, right? I know zoning is not enough. Zoning, sometimes it's held up as the gold standard, right? There is a lot of opportunity. It's something that we control locally. We don't control inflation and other things. So can you walk us through how you have used that as a tool in your world to really move solutions forward for housing?
Yeah, so zoning is important. It's something that when you drive down your roads every day, when you drive into your neighborhood, when you go shopping, all of that's strategically planned. Planners think about where work locations are, how that relates to where you live, how that relates to how you access transit. And so one of the best tools we have to help drive new housing is making changes to our zoning codes. So for example, an easy thing that you've probably heard about previously, hopefully you've heard about, are something called accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. You might have heard them referred to as granny flats. They are becoming something that's almost mainstream in many communities, and basically what they are is an allowance of an additional unit on a single family lot. So sometimes it's the space over top of a garage. Sometimes it's a small little cottage in the backyard. Sometimes it's actually a unit connected to the single family house. But just allowing that and providing an opportunity for a second family, maybe a family member related to you, maybe your parents will move in there, or a child will move in there while they're looking for that job opportunity. Just providing that is a way to add some mild density to the neighborhoods and provide more affordable housing options. On the back end of that is too, it also helps homeowners, because if a homeowner now has a unit that they can rent out, that's also providing them some additional money every month that they can use to invest back in the economy. And so ADUs are one example of a zoning reform that's becoming very common. Another one is simply getting rid of single family zoning. There are certain communities where you're not going to completely get rid of single family homes. You're not going to go to an open zoning allowance, but you can diversify your zoning. So in many communities, single family homes are the predominant, usually by 70% or more, housing stock in the community. But if you can say that now your single family home districts also allow duplexes or even quadplexes, just some additional mild density, you're now opening up the market. You're helping developers bring new product to the community, and you're helping residents who are existing in the community and new to the community have new housing options. So just through some of those tools and techniques, you can kind of maintain that neighborhood character, but start chipping away at that 35,000 housing units that we have to provide.
And I think something to highlight too is that not all of that zoning reform is necessarily new, right? So we have a development in Grand Haven that I've shared with some of you that when I bring people there, I expect everyone to be really excited about it, because they have been able to do new construction with partnership in the community as low as $139,000 offered, which we know is just not existing here, right? And when people come to the neighborhood, they go, this is great, so what? Right? Because prior to the 1960s, we allowed for smaller lot and unit sizes. And so our push for these larger, we can have single families still on smaller lots. We can look at townhomes and condos and duplexes and look at building more diversity into a community that adds value, adds incremental change, and really starts to get at this issue without making major changes, right?
Yeah, it's the change in having a 75-foot lot as opposed to a 40-foot lot. And if you can have multiple 40s, you've just doubled the density of that road.
I think it's maybe important to note also, I guess, two things. One, when we talk about getting rid of or reducing single-family zoning, that does not mean single-family homes cease to exist.
Yes.
The ones that are still there, they're not going anywhere by and large. And
or
you
that
can
they
still
won't
build
still be
them
built, exactly.
in places. It's just, you can also build other things. Another point I want to make is we talk about single family neighborhoods as though they're like this American, well, they're certainly an American creation, but they've only existed for about 100 years. These zones, they were created for the first time in Berkeley in 1916. This is not a thing that has been with us in the US, much less the world, for all that long, in the same way as highways and all the congestion and everything that comes with those. These are new developments that we chose and we thought would turn out really well. And there have been a lot of negative consequences we didn't really foresee, but are certainly living with now. And we shouldn't treat these things as somehow foundational to our society, because they were innovations from a very recent past, and we can continue to innovate. Can I ask a question over here just quickly?
Go for it.
Because you kind of got to it, but I don't think we fully covered it. You're talking about the increased costs, and obviously spending more money on that is one solution, and it is a solution that places should do. But can you talk also about the role that zoning and other development standards reforms can play in reducing the cost side of things, at least on a per unit basis? And maybe also just, I think when people talk about, maybe this is like my California bias showing, but there's a kind of anti-developer, anti-profit perspective among a lot of advocates. And I think there's a view that zoning reform is just like a giveaway to developers, and specifically for-profit developers. And it's my understanding, my view, that it's really just as beneficial to affordable and subsidized developers. But like, I would like to hear that from you, if or if you disagree.
Right. I mean, when our organization comes in to build a affordable housing development, we have to comply with all the zoning rules too, right? So if the zoning requires 2 parking spaces per bedroom per housing development, and we're building housing for 30% of very low-income families whose income is less than $10,000 a year, we still have to provide those 2 parking spaces for them, even though they don't necessarily have cars, right? And so zoning ordinances apply to everybody, and they do drive up the cost of housing for those reasons, right? We design how much parking we need, which means we decide how many homes we provide for our cars, limits the homes we provide for people. And those are some of the choices that we make as a community when we're doing the zoning regulations. And they apply across, again, like you said, across the spectrum. It doesn't matter who's developing the homes. Everybody has to abide by those rules. And so these are some of those pieces, right? I think the other big pieces around minimum lot size and minimum home size. If we're looking to build homes, Dwelling Place has long time been a provider of affordable rental housing. We are recently looking at how do we do a better job of providing affordable home ownership opportunities, partly because we see that right now there's no place for people to leave our rental housing and move into. Historically, people can move from our homes and buy a house in the City of Grand Rapids or in Wyoming, and they are now cost out of that possibility. And so we're trying to step in and kind of create these opportunities. But in many places, if we want to build a home, we have to build a 2,000 square foot house on an 80-foot wide lot, because that's all the zoning allows. And so as we look at these practices, which are really exclusionary zoning practices, which are designed to keep low-income people from moving into communities, if we look at how we can remove these barriers, that allows us to build smaller houses that are more affordable for people to get that starter house, that we just haven't built starter houses in the country or in our community for a couple decades now. And if we start doing that, we create those pathways for normal families to move into home ownership again.
And I think that point too, when we talk about the benefit of zoning reform, we talk about its direct impact, right? Land is expensive. And so if we can build more on that land, we can reduce the cost of land, and that gets passed on from a developer to the end consumer. And those changes have a really big impact on the person whose paycheck is going towards that mortgage, right? And their ability to access that. So you touched on kind of construction costs. We talked on zoning reform as a potential opportunity. I want to quickly just talk about too the fact that we know that there is land costs. We know that laws, zoning impact it. We know that lending, because construction costs have gone up. Shane, if you could share your insight. We know locally we have a lot of ability to have an impact, but we also recognize that we are still limited, right? We are limited in some of those tools. And so could you share with us a couple of best practices from statewide solutions that maybe we could be advocating for in addition to our local changes as well?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I don't think there are many state reforms that are unique. They're really about getting cities to do things that they frankly won't in many cases. And There's a political problem where every individual city at some level is incentivized to push the problem of, if you don't want to consider it an opportunity, the problem of housing onto someone else and say, well, we don't need to do it, someone else will do it. Yeah. But when everyone is saying that, you get into real trouble. And that's basically the story of all of the United States at this point, especially the coasts, but it's kind of spread. And it's gotten worse in other places outside of the coast in part because the coasts are exporting so many people because they're not building housing either. And so the burden is pushed onto here. It's this prisoner's dilemma problem. But if everyone were to do their part, the actual burden of change would not be that great on each individual community. And this is where I think the state really plays an important role. At the end of the day, almost everything that local governments do is an authority granted to them by the state. And the state has the right, if it chooses, and if it sees that local governments are not doing what is necessary to maintain affordability, to give people opportunity, to keep businesses in the state because they can't afford to pay people, then they can step in and say, look, we're going to establish minimum zoning standards where you can't have single family housing, at least across the entire city. We're going to require that you allow accessory dwelling units and not charge excessive fees or require 15,000 square foot lots in order to build them. Parking reform is another thing where you can say, we're not going to allow you to require more parking often than households themselves use. And so it's just this pure waste, environmentally and financially. And so that's really, I think, where the state can step in and has increasingly stepped in many states, especially the coasts. And a point I often make is coming from California, like so much less affordable than here. It is a disaster for affordability. But we're not doing anything different than what is being done here. We just have more demand and have for a longer amount of time. And as that demand cascades down to other places and the population just grows generally, the same forces are going to operate and are operating here, and they're going to catch up with you. And so my call to action really is to do something before you get to California level problems, because it is where you're headed, and you can either choose to try to solve them now when it's easier, frankly, and the gap between a market rate unit and an affordable unit is not, for us, it's more like $400,000 or $500,000 a unit in subsidies on top of just the little amount of money you can get in loans because you're actually getting some revenue. So don't wait, don't wait till then. But again, I think if we just leave it to individual cities, we're probably not going to get there. The state has to play some role. And even the federal government can't really force things so much, but they can spend money. They can incentivize as well.
And I think I love that point because, we talk about the state has a responsibility, the federal government has a responsibility to support. But I think we all would love to be able to show up at our community meetings and be a part of that planning process and not have those regulations come down. And we're in a position where we can still maintain some of that locally, those solutions, because we're not to that level, although we're still in a critical space, right? And so we have a unique opportunity to look at those local solutions. I think
a lot of those state solutions, those state mandates, those state directives, they come from local governments who have tried things and seen success.
Yes.
And that, it's the whole laboratories of democracy kind of idea.
Right. And I think that's the benefit is that we're seeing some of those changes. When it comes to zoning, specifically at a local level, I think the difficulty is that you had mentioned it's just 100 years old as a practice. We zone for land use, so we say industrial versus commercial versus residential. But in the case of residential, we then zone by housing typology, right? So we say single family versus multifamily versus what we're going to allow. And a lot of that really came from what you were talking about, the exclusionary practice of what you think, your perception around what that building brings, the type of person or the we hear crime rates, we hear all of these things that we know with data are not accurate, but they're real in people's minds. And so
in many places it followed where you would have cities that would try
Yep.
race-based zoning, for example, just saying white people live here, black people live here. Baltimore did that, a few other places did that. That was pretty quickly struck down by the Supreme Court. But then you had covenants that just said on the property level, you can't sell to a person of color, a person of color cannot occupy this home. Those things almost always came first.
Yeah.
And as they were struck down or at least weakened by usually the courts, then local officials and people in the real estate industry and so forth would come in and devise new ways to achieve similar ends.
Right.
How can we exclude black people in most cases in particular without saying anything about race?
Right.
And that is in many ways not the origin of single family zoning, but it is the major reason that it and similar practices spread to the degree that they did. And
Right.
it's not a coincidence that the timing of downzoning many of our communities across the country was right around the same time as the Civil Rights Movement and Civil Rights Act in the 1960s.
So we know that upzoning is an opportunity, right? And Nicole, you've worked on what some of this looks like in your community. Can you walk us through some of the politics, or the whole group here can kind of share? We can have best practices, we can have ideas for upzoning, how we can allow for diversity of housing to be built alongside single family. But what does it require from a political perspective or other things? What does it look like in the day-to-day of actually implementing those things?
Yeah, I mean, communities spend 2 years putting together a master plan, holding community meetings and talking about what's that future for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And a lot of effort and often money goes into creating these documents, and they're the guidebook, right? It's the map that you use, and every project that comes forward, you look back at that guidebook and you're saying, okay, this is the direction the community wanted to head in, and so we're going to pull this project forward. The challenge oftentimes is that memories are short. And so the plan that was adopted that had 18 months worth of work put into it or more, now that there's a project that's on the table, all of that talk about wanting to add mixed use zones or add duplexes to neighborhoods or whatever that project might be, some of that gets lost in that from the time that the plan's adopted to when the project comes forward. And so it takes a lot of continued education, and it also takes elected officials, because ultimately in some of these projects, they're the ones finalizing that rezone or approving that action, to stand behind that plan and say, yes, this is what this body adopted, this was the vision of our community, and we're gonna stick to it. And so that's a challenge that a lot of communities have. And it's where education comes into play, and it's where understanding why you've made those decisions are really important. Having that foundational background of, it is important to keep working towards this goal. It's not an easy goal to get to, but continuing to work toward this goal, to have the understanding that this is the vision the community is working towards, is important.
The policy really matters too, though, because the process, when we say we're going to have this 2-year community planning process, but then when someone proposes a project, we also have a bunch of community meetings where people get to give input and feedback and critiques and so forth. It's at some level a betrayal of that original community planning process that you had, hundreds of people, thousands of people who are engaged in that really involved process.
But now 5 people are mad.
5 people show up to a meeting and they get to change the whole plan. And that's not to say there's no role for local input, but for one, it happened already. That opportunity was there, and it just comes across as it gives the appearance of corruption, that the rules are being changed arbitrarily.
And it adds cost.
Adds cost, uncertainty.
The consistency of following your master plan is certainly beneficial, not only for residents, but for developers who have to put a lot of money up front early to be able to even navigate that process. And so one thing that you talk a lot about in your book is, reducing that.
Credit?
Reducing those opportunities, streamlining the process. What projects can be approved by right so that they don't have to go before multiple boards and commissions, removing some of that ambiguity for the developers. If you bring a project forward that meets all of these checkpoints, your project will be approved. And so opportunities to apply those to municipalities, to streamline that process and make it easier. It's not just for the benefit of a developer, it's for the benefit of the community, so that they know that when they attended those meetings and they said, yes, we want to see this future, they know that that's the future that's going to be delivered.
And I think too, there's a huge opportunity. So those master plans, the City of Grand Rapids is going through their master plan right now. So if you live here, work here, show up to those meetings. But those determine development for the next 20 years. Right? And so I think there is still a tension with what you create in your master plan by the residents who choose to show up, right? And the future residents and their ability to partake in that conversation. And so there's a space for kind of that debate that happens, but what we're seeing is some of the things that people want most. People in this community want diversity of housing type, and it's not allowed. And so every single instance it's going to that, right? I get asked about townhomes and condos and all of these things. We are zoned for single family in every community in this region, right? And so there's every development that does not fit that is going in front of those approval process. And so making sure our communities are committed to that engagement process like they are, and all of you showing up to participate, right? And being a part of that, to ensure that not just for you, but your future neighbors, your kids' kids, right? 20 years is a long time, and making sure that those master plans are considering these things as they develop and move forward.
And I would add to that when you do have projects, when you get the mailer in your mailbox that says your planning commission is going to be talking about this project, show up. Talk about why it's important for your community. Oftentimes, meetings are filled with those who have concerns or want to question the project. You don't typically hear the positive voice, the person championing it, that says, well, I was part of this process and we're excited to see this. Our community needs this. So don't just throw out those mailers. They're important. We're required to send them out when the projects move forward. And when you get one, come to that meeting and share your thoughts on the project.
Don't only show up if you're angry.
Yeah.
Show up if you're happy too. Support those elected officials.
Show up,
but also show up.
And then also tell them, please change the process so I don't have to show up.
So I can be home for dinner. Yeah.
Because most people don't want to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And I understand it.
I want to speak just on housing choice and housing options, right? Like we, as a community, one of the challenges, we don't have a lot of options for housing, right? We live in a community that was predominantly built, the City of Grand Rapids was mostly built prior to the 1950s, when most people lived in two-parent houses with 3 to 5 kids or whatever, right? It was a very different world than which we live in now. And yet we still have homes that were designed for that type of household. And we don't have a lot of diversity of housing stock.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, right, a master plan lasts for 20 years. 20 years ago, there were no iPhones in the world, right? There was no Uber, there was no Lyft, there was no rideshare programs. Like the way we live now is fundamentally different. 20 years is a long time. And we need to be able to design housing strategies and philosophies that are very flexible, even though we build buildings that last for 100 years at a time, right? There's a reason why there's been so little innovation in the housing world, is because it is such a long horizon. Yet that's a major challenge, because the way we live and the way we house is very different than it was before.
Shane, you shared the number, and we see it in household growth. We continue to see an increase in the number of households that are just one person, right? Whether that's baby boomers who are aging, or you have millennials, right? You have these two huge demographics of folks and smaller household sizes, yet we're requiring them to be a part of single family, to purchase those larger, more expensive homes. And so I think what's critical, you mentioned choice, single family should exist and it should continue to be built, as should all of the other housing typologies that were mentioned here, because if you are able to downsize, you should be able to. If you desire, you should not be forced to. Stay in your single family home if you want to, but it should financially make sense for you to downsize so that you can make room for the family who needs that home and down the line. So we're gonna open up to questions. You can share here too. I'm just gonna quickly ask you all for one kind of closing thought before we open it up to the room, that we know this issue is complex, we know it's challenging, we know it's critical, but we also know it can be incredibly overwhelming, right? We talk about a lot here, there's a lot of players, but what can everyone here in this room do? So if you could share just kind of your insight into that, and we'll get more into it, I'm sure, in Q&A, but just leave us on a note of positivity of how everybody can activate and be called to action, as was mentioned earlier, to be a part of the solution.
Well, I'll just say part of why I have this 3S supply stability subsidy framework is I think it's not just important as a policy framework, as a way to get the right things done, but also as a way to build partnerships and coalitions. Because if you as the YIMBY pro-supply person can actually partner with the tenant advocate and the nonprofit housing developer and the environmentalist and so on, you're going to get things done in a way that you probably can't if you're just trying to go it alone. And so I think having that broader perspective and finding people who, focus on whatever you are most interested in for sure, but try to build those partnerships. And I guess that one other thing I would say is push your state and local officials, let them know what you support, that their expectations that you and your community are going to oppose any kind of reform in that neighborhood, let them know that's not true and that they've got you behind them, because they don't hear from you usually. They mostly just hear from people who are opposed to really any kind of change.
If you don't know what YIMBY means, it means yes in my backyard, and it's the alternative to NIMBY, which is not in my backyard. And so it means that you're the person who shows up and says, I support housing in my community, I support more diversity of housing in my community, and I support new neighbors who maybe are in a different life phase than me and can't afford what I can afford. And so you show up because you want to support housing solutions, and therefore you're a YIMBY. So you're all dedicated YIMBYs after tonight, not letting you out without it. So go ahead, Nicole.
So everything that Shane said, plus, real quick, how many people in the room live in Grand Rapids? You're going through a master plan process right now. Get involved, go to their website, learn where their community meetings are. This is your opportunity to talk about what you want your neighborhoods to look like for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
And they do have an online portal as well. If you can't make it to an evening meeting, you can do it online.
I think to some extent you're all doing it already, right? One thing that we can all do is educate ourselves about what these things are, right? Housing issues can be very complex and they're very simple. We choose where people live. I believe that everyone deserves a dwelling place, right? And so how do we make that happen? I think part of that is being willing to kind of figure it out together. One thing that we can be doing is making sure we talk to each other, right? Because it is our neighbors, it's our cousins, maybe, it's our friends that are out there saying, no, not here. And we are the ones that have to have those conversations with folks so that when the nonprofit organization comes or the developer comes that's looking to build the development that is a good development that does address these issues, that there's people around supporting it and moving it forward. And I think that takes a community that's starting to advocate for these changes. And advocacy starts in our personal relationships.
Amazing. All right, we could talk about this forever, and we will if you don't ask questions. But it's time for Q&A, so we want to get your insights. We can dive a little bit deeper into your interests. So feel free to raise your hand, and we've got folks with mics coming around. I recognize that face. Hi, Alex with Housing Kent.
Kudos to Housing Next. What a great presentation, and thanks for this wonderful panel. So if I'm a homeowner and I purchased at a time where I was able to afford a reasonably priced home, and I'm looking over the next, 30 years of my life and really hoping for an appreciation in my home value. And Shane, you tell us we have two choices, rising home values or build more housing. Make the case to me. Why should I want to open up supply if I'm a homeowner who's excited about seeing my principal in my equity go up and up and up and up. And if you'll indulge a second question, I'd love to hear more about the stability and the tenant protections that you think would accompany a supply strategy.
Sure. It's a really, really good question and a difficult one, to be honest, because there's not a slam dunk answer to this. I don't think there are trade-offs here, but I do think it is taken for granted that rising home values are just like an unmitigated good for homeowners. I think the most persuasive argument I've come across is to ask people what they think, where they think their children are going to live, and if that matters to them. Because if prices keep rising faster than incomes, when their kids graduate from college or high school or whatever, are they going to be able to live in your community? Are they going to be able to live within 50 miles of your community? And the answer in many places is no. And I think that means something to a lot of people. I also think, a point I often make is that yes, your home values are rising, and yes, there are benefits to that for sure. It's also, people think of it as this like pot of money that's just sitting there waiting to be, to like improve their lives in a really dramatic way. But if your home value is increasing, so are all the home values around you. And so in terms of like your opportunity to upgrade, if anything, it's getting further away, because that home that was 10% more expensive than yours 10 years ago, it's still at least 10% more expensive, but 10% went from $30,000 to $50,000. And so things are moving further away from you. Your taxes have gone up. The problems in your community coming from affordability are worsening because you have more homelessness. The cost of providing rent assistance is higher. The cost that you have to pay workers in the city is higher. And so all the goods and services are more expensive. There's a lot of downsides that are not really appreciated. And important to note that as bad as that is for homeowners, it is infinitely worse for renters who have nothing to offset it. They're not getting any home equity. And so, we should, I think, just as like moral human beings, be concerned with that. So that's a few things. On the stability side of things, the two main ones that I always advocate for are rent stabilization and just cause eviction protections. And rent control, rent stabilization is a very controversial policy, but it is also a very misunderstood policy in that most of what people have in their mind about how rent control works comes from examples like New York and other places that have actually New York doesn't even really have this form of rent control anymore, known as vacancy control, where rents can't increase even between tenants. Almost everywhere that has rent control or rent stabilization, as I call this form, allows rents to reset to market rate when someone moves out. It addresses a lot of the problems that are traditionally associated with rent control, like a reduction in housing supply through reduced development and conversions into condos, kind of black market issues that crop up because you have a unit that's renting for below market and you can just like take a $10,000 payment for someone to access that rather because you can't charge higher rents. So there's lots of things, I could go on, but that form of rent control where you decontrol the rents between tenancies provides a lot of stability for the people once they move in without so throwing off the market that you're gonna really have severe consequences elsewhere. And that's sort of a major component of my argument for balancing supply and stability and seeing how the two intersect. The last one, or the second one, is just cause eviction or good cause eviction protections, which for one have to complement, they have to go with rent stabilization if you have it. You can't really have one without the other. But it's also just good on its own. And it basically just says you can't evict tenants for no reason. And in most places you can. No reason at all. And so you can evict them if they don't pay. You can evict them if they break their lease. You can evict them if you want to move in or if you need to redevelop the property. There's lots of things you can still do, but it's avoiding this kind of arbitrariness that tenants have to deal with pretty much everywhere in the United States.
And I think a note to that, we find ourselves in a really critical time because we have the moral argument for more housing, right, that we've talked about here and that you're talking about. And we also have the economic argument for more housing. And so wherever you fall on that spectrum, or wherever your loved ones and neighbors and network fall on that spectrum, we all have the same goal, which is that housing impacts our economic ability. It impacts our moral obligation as neighbors, as community members. And so we live in a moment where that momentum is real. And so this is an opportunity to be able to talk about how all of those things align and move forward something that is aligned and helps support all of those spaces. Do you have any comments, Jeremy, on that question?
No, I think just carrying on that, it might feel like you're getting ahead when housing prices are going up, but like you said, it moves you further away from your next house, and it makes the rest, if rapidly rising housing prices just increase wealth disparities in a community, and there's a lot of reasons why wealth disparities make your life worse, right? It makes everything else more expensive, and you actually get further behind, even if it feels like you're getting ahead.
And reduce your choice, right?
Yeah.
Because if you want to downsize, let's say you decide you don't want to be in this humongous home because you don't have kids anymore, and you literally are stuck because you can't downsize because it doesn't make any financial sense to do so, you're not going to leave. And therefore that impacts your ability to even make that choice, what's best for your phase of life.
This might be controversial, but I'm going to say it because it's definitely true.
That's what we're here for.
The idea that housing builds wealth is kind of a misnomer. Buying housing and watching it appreciate in value is transferring wealth. It is transferring wealth from whoever's buying from you to you. And often whoever's buying from you is younger. They're more likely to be a person of color. They are more likely to be poorer and less wealthy. Every dollar that your home goes up in value, well, just a point I'll make, about 80 to 90% of people's home equity is from appreciation, not paying off their home. And so that appreciation, as an individual, none of us really is responsible for that. The fact that I live in Los Angeles and home prices have gone up 50% in however many years, or 300% in 30 years, and someone who lives in Cleveland, for example, has seen their home go up basically nothing in value, it's not because I did anything to earn that. I was just lucky. And we need to recognize that, and also just recognize that for every dollar we are gaining in home value that's not like from our direct investment, it is coming from someone, and it's not producing anything. It's just making us richer at someone else's expense. Doesn't make us a bad person. We live in the system and we have, what are we going to do? But we can try to change the policies that are leading to that outcome.
Other questions? Oh, we've got one in the back and then one in the middle next.
So I have a couple of questions, and hopefully I'm able to properly word the questions well for you guys. Out of the numbers you mentioned, 35,000, I don't think I had anything that addresses or specifically addresses student housing. Mm-hmm. And that has really been, as a student, that has really been one of the issues lots of students are currently noticing. It seems like most of the time, the thoughts or understanding out there is most of the universities will cater for student housing, but there's really a large number of students who don't stay on campus housing. And that makes it when trying to rent off campus, the rates we get is always geared or focused towards people who they believe are already working or already have good jobs out there. Then the second question I have is probably going to focus a little bit more of it would be more for Shane Phillips. I've seen instances where, because I'm an international student, I've lived in other countries and I also came here and I've seen this same stuff happen. I've seen where investors from different states look at states with affordable housing and feel you know what, let me go to that state, buy a property, renovate it, and increase the houses or increase the rents or whatever for people. Are there any policies checkmating stuff like this? I would like to know that, because even living here, I've seen that happen. I have a friend who has a colleague working with Google, buy a couple of properties here, and they were discussing how they were going to just refurbish, renovate, and increase the prices. And I was like, that is a little bit unfair, but they were it's business. So the third question I have has to do more with DEI. As an international student, just like you said, people are not scared of having neighbors, but as an international student, I've seen situations where people tend not want to rent houses to certain people for some reasons best known to them, and sometimes they come up with lots of terms and conditions, you need to have multiple references to be able to get these apartments, which sometimes I don't really see the need of that. I believe probably if they use the excuse of being an international, showing them ties with with an institution, for example, my school here should be enough for them to but I don't know if this is just an excuse. And so those are like the three questions I have, and hopefully it makes sense in the way I was hoping it will.
Does anyone have student housing comments?
So we have a little bit of student housing in Wyoming, and what I can say is it's a challenge because oftentimes, especially when it's provided by the university, it can be provided at a rate that's much lower than what the market can tolerate or will have. And so when you talk about needing affordable housing in a community, a lot of times that's targeted towards recently graduated students who are new in their careers and are making salaries that aren't at the same level as someone who's been working for 20 or 30 or 40 years, likely. And so, some things that we can do through zoning, like allowing accessory dwelling units. I know of a couple instances where we have students who are living above someone's garage or, as in a unit in someone's home. Those can help reduce costs. And the one thing that we didn't talk about in this presentation that I wanted to kind of push in there
You got your
were
spot.
micro units. We didn't talk a lot about micro units, and we talked a lot about home ownership, but when we talk about rental, micro units are becoming more popular, and they allow developers to provide smaller spaces, which especially as a student, you may not need a 2-bedroom apartment. But
In the library all the
a
time
library,
anyway.
exactly. So 300 square feet or 250 square feet is an appropriate size, and it comes in at a much more affordable price point. Now, a lot of communities won't allow micro units, or it's just now, especially in Michigan, becoming more popular, and that's something that has to occur through zoning reform. We have to get more aggressive about saying that not everyone needs a 5 or 6 or 7 or 800 square foot apartment, that there are opportunities to provide 250 or 300 square foot apartments.
Well, and I've heard the argument that an argument for not doing micro units is that people shouldn't have to live in that small of a space, right? But that's obviously coming from a lens of someone who prefers not to live in that size of space. But what we see is a demand from students, from one-person households, whatever it is, for that. And if the demand is there and folks want to have that, the alternative sometimes is no home, right? And so what are we arguing against there?
People almost always have the option of, for example, having roommates in a larger home. And so if they choose to live in a micro unit, that is because they prefer
To live alone.
that smaller unit and the kind of solitude of it, the independence of it, to the roommate situation. It's not taking away options. And I think that's always an important and kind of a theme here.
Right.
We're not trying to take away anyone's options. We're trying to
provide
add
more options. And I think another point that maybe indirectly comments on that is, I'll just share something I heard earlier. I think, so we heard earlier in our conversation at lunch with a small group that there's a push against students in a community or a push against renters in a community because they don't contribute. The community doesn't see the same kind of contribution from renters because of their temporariness that they see from home ownership opportunities, right? And so I think I would challenge all of us in this room to really think about some of those biases that we have, because we heard a list of accomplishments that far surpass me from a college student who is contributing to this community and being a part of this. And so they're in many ways having more impact, right? Also, they pay taxes. People think that they don't, but renters do pay taxes.
It's really hard to contribute to your community when you're paying 70% of your income on
You have to
rent,
work
going
3
to school,
jobs.
working 3 jobs.
Right.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to
check those biases at the door. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
On the question about buyers from other states, I'll also add buyers from other countries is often brought up. I really chafe at when that is brought up because I think it can lean towards some xenophobia. We see a lot of this in California, Vancouver, BC, a lot of the coasts where people are blaming like Chinese buyers, and there's just a whiff of something there that I don't really appreciate. But it's not to say that it's not an issue at all. But I'll put foreign buyers aside. I think there's maybe a place for some limitations, at least if the people are not living in those. Buyers from other states is a whole other matter because we're talking most often about American U.S. citizens, and it's I'm not sure we want to go down the road of saying like someone living in one state can't buy something in another state. It's just gets into a really dicey kind of policy and legal and economic territory. But I guess what I would say here, and this is not like a solution, but I think it's just something to consider, is it was not common 20 years ago for people living in one state to, like regular people, investors have always done this, but like people who make $100,000 or $150,000 a year, which is regular-ish. I have a coworker who is from Minneapolis, and she and her husband bought a home in Minnesota maybe 5 or 10 years ago because they couldn't afford to buy one in California, and they wanted to buy something, and they just rented out. And so this is increasingly common, and so my point really is just that it all comes back to supply and affordability, how, for one, the fact that people in other places are seeing themselves as having really no other option but to buy in cheaper locales, and that is having an impact on affordability in them. That's a real problem. But also, whether it's the individual or Blackstone buying thousands of single-family homes and renting them out, a lot of this comes down to, because we have institutionalized housing scarcity for the benefit of housing values, we've made housing a very, very good investment such that everyone wants to get in on it. And we kind of need to change that if we don't want it to be something where everyone's trying to pour all their money into it. If it weren't a great investment anymore and it was just, mainly for housing as opposed to wealth, then we would see a lot less of this. And that's a very long road to get there, but I think that's where we need to head.
2 points to build off that. One, it's not a historic normative. It hasn't been that way all the time, right? It's really the last 30 years where housing has been a great investment in this country. Before that, most people, housing across the country generally kept up with inflation, right? It was a safe investment. You didn't lose a ton of money in it, but you didn't make a lot of money. You paid down your mortgage, and that's how you made wealth.
It's like a form of security as opposed to wealth.
And so I think that's important to recognize, that we can choose to separate those things again. Right? We can do more shared equity type of housing where we are starting to choose to take some of our housing, not all of it, but just remove it from those market forces, right? We can use community land trust, we can use co-ops, we can use other types of shared ownership models to remove a percentage of our housing from those market forces and just allow people to have a home that is not a financial investment in the same way. And those are things that, as a community, I think we need to start to look at and say, how do we start to shift the way we look at housing? Because yes, housing is a primary form of wealth creation, and housing is a primary form of housing people. And we can't always get everything, and we need to look at how do we find that right balance in it. In a world that's very different now, again, if property values have gone up 99% over the last 5 years in our region, and we can look at the coast and know what our future looks like 20 years from now, because they experienced this 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We can start to make choices now that create a different future for ourselves than what you have in California right now, where there is no affordable housing options in most communities anymore.
Well, and a terminology that we hear a lot is, you cite it in your book, is NOAH, or naturally occurring affordable housing. And I think another thing that we have the ability to do is ensure that tools we create have the ability to be a resource for maintaining naturally occurring affordable housing, so that if someone wants to come in, they are able to look at a home that is older, and they're able to there's capital available to them to make the advancements that need to be made for that to be a quality house, right? So it's safe, but it might not have granite countertops, and it may not increase by $500 per month. Right? And so those are opportunities. The Kent County Revolving Loan Fund that I mentioned, the legislative tools, those all include the ability to look at our affordable housing that exists naturally and make the necessary improvements, but kind of combat that incentive then to come in and make an immense profit off of it.
Did anyone have a response to his last question? I can speak to it, but I don't want to dominate everything here. The third one on he said DEI, but I think it's more just stability and landlord practices and that kind of thing. Yeah. And let's be blunt, racism.
Just racism. Yeah. I mean, go ahead and go for it.
Have it.
Oh.
You said you had something you want to say, so go ahead. I've got plenty to say too, but.
Well, this is where I think regulating landlords is really important, and just cause eviction protections and rent stabilization are part of that. I myself am a landlord. I own a duplex that I bought 5 years ago, and the tenant already lived there when I bought it, and they pay half of market rate. and they have a lot of protections, and that's a good thing. Like in fact, I was able to afford the place because that tenant lived there, because the place was worth less because their rents were lower. But anyway, other tenant protections are a little more they're still universal, but they're a little more targeted. So things like, having a system, I think Oregon and some other places have this, or Portland, where you don't have to pay for a background check for every single application. Like you can just do one and not pay $35 for the 10 places you're applying to each time. So there's things like that. There's things like, some things that go further, I'm not sure this is always a good idea, but for example, rules that basically require landlords to accept the first qualified tenant as opposed to just kind of picking between them. And you can see how that could lead to racist outcomes if people are just able to everyone's qualified, so I'm going to pick the one I like the most. And what does that look like often? I think there's costs to that as well. So it's something to be careful about, but it's worth thinking about for sure. And then just limitations on those kinds of requirements generally for applications, I think are warranted. And again, you see this in the rental market, you see it in the homeownership market, where the tighter things get, the more scarce housing is, the more power and leverage the owners of property are. And so you start getting, renters and homebuyers have to not only bid above the asking price, but they have to give a letter to the home seller
saying why they should be
like
picked.
A sob story about here's my family, here's why you should sell to us and not these other people. That should not be necessary. But again,
market constraints.
We need protections on one level, but we also just need abundance. So that kind of thing is not the kind of thing that can be expected reasonably by the people who own the property.
I would add that in the city of Grand Rapids, there is some additional protections in place. So there is, landlords have to post application fees in their advertising or they cannot charge them. If they charge an application fee, they have to be able to explain what they spent that money on and prove that they spent all the money in processing an application and refund the difference. So those are pieces that are in place in the city of Grand Rapids, at least to help reduce some of those pieces aspect. The city of Grand Rapids does have a human rights ordinance that also expands kind of protected classes, and you have the ability to file a notice with the city if you feel like that's happening. And there's a fair housing center that also will take applications. So if you or any of your friends are being discriminated in the housing process, there are some local protections in place to help prevent that from happening. Again, the city of Grand Rapids is not currently resourcing their department well enough to be able to take all the applications and move forward with them. We have some opportunities around there, but there are some protections in place that we have locally to help build off of those strengths.
And I'll add, with the Fair Housing Center, you can also reach out to them for advice.
Yeah.
And so if what you're hearing from a prospective landlord or from a landlord you're not sure of, you can reach out to them and get some assistance from attorneys and those who work in the world who can help guide you on what your steps might be.
I think we had another question down in the middle. If you could raise your hand again.
We have time for one final question.
Okay, it looks like this gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. Yeah, real briefly. This is more of perhaps a zoning and construction question, but what's the viability of converting a lot of these homes that are single family dwellings into with taking a 1,500 or 1,800 square foot home and making it into 2 900 square foot units without necessarily changing the curb appeal or changes to the exterior of the house, and then creating duplex within single family dwellings that already exists?
Yeah, I think it is a strategy that does happen in many places. Used to happen more frequently. Now, oftentimes it is really restricted by zoning ordinance and building code. So there are some challenges in that, right? And the building code for multifamily housing is different than for single family, and so sometimes it is the building code really makes it hard to divide a house into too many smaller pieces, and for good reasons, right? It's just you need to have fire protections, and you don't want one person kind of having those consequences. But it is, and that's sometimes also another. The term ADU was used earlier, auxiliary dwelling unit. Those can be kind of external or internal units. A lot of communities do really encourage the development of that internal dwelling unit, right? Where there's still a major house, but you take that extra bedroom that's on the main floor, put a separate entrance and a bathroom and a little kitchen in there, and you have another housing unit off the back. And those types of strategies are things that we need to find a way to encourage more. Again, I think we shared earlier, Brooke shared earlier, we're looking at 35,000 units in Kent County is what the need is, right? I think the city of Grand Rapids currently has about 80,000 housing units. To put that in context,
Yep.
That's a lot of housing that we need to find ways to add. There is not that much more land in the city of Grand Rapids to be able to develop into those housing, so we need to find ways to use existing housing, existing land, and get more housing onto it. And so that idea of taking an existing house, again, we don't have as many larger families that need the larger houses. How do we divide those houses into something smaller that meets the current demand from the increasing 1 and 2 person household? It has to be part of our solutions because it is a much more affordable solution than anything else we have.
So we talk about zoning reform a lot. We're talking about folks getting involved, right? And I know we're wrapping up here. I want to throw out, it's a shameless plug, but all of you have the opportunity to be a part of what we've talked about, looking into your local municipality master plan, figuring out what it says, being a part of these national conversations by thought leaders like Shane, getting involved with your nonprofit or for-profit developers, listening to them, being an advocate for their projects in your municipality. I just want to share, we do have a resource on our website at housingnext.org where you can put in your name, you can join our coalition called Yes West Michigan, and you'll get all of this information when a project is coming up in the community that you can show up and support. You'll get talking points, those types of things. But the reason I point it out is because if you put your name in there, we will know what jurisdiction you live and work if you choose to share that with us. And then we can make sure to send you information that is valid to your community so that you can be a part of these conversations moving forward. So housingnext.org, please sign up to stay in the loop on additional ways to be a part of these conversations. Anything else before we wrap up tonight? Yes.
My name is Shane Phillips, and I was just at the legislature yesterday
Mhm.
with our representatives, and no one is addressing the efficiency of the misappropriation and mismanagement of the homeless system currently, or housing regarding portfolio. And I made multiple reports. I talked before the city commission, actually staying at Dwelling Place currently, being violated by fair housing voucher. Parking. The city stole $81,000 of parking revenue from 2019 to 2022 of holiday parking because they failed to do their job and report the holiday schedule. Why isn't anybody talking about this? The numbers, the data you're getting, the Census Bureau already has stated that it's been messed up because of COVID. There's nothing they can do for the next 10 years. Who's adjusting for those numbers? Okay, I am currently being trained by the Fair Housing in Detroit by the Executive Director for Civil Rights for Fair Housing. Not only I have been vetted by an American Bar attorney for equal protection of the law under Title 42. I have asked the city body multiple times to come to the table to address these deficiencies. The Auditor General is giving an emergency report to the legislative body to address that there is deficiencies significantly impacting the administration of housing. And we're not having this conversation in a proper form and forum to come to the table to deal with these things, or the units of measures that have been designed that the Brownfield Development Authority has been in charge of. So we have special interests that are also a conflict of interest that are not being audited across the board with these mechanisms, with people in their private capacity involved in the public capacity. And until we address those, you can sit here and talk about money on days, numbers about data, the need for supply and demand. You're not going to get to the core issue. You're still be walking and chasing the same issue. So I implore everybody to come up to the table and really ask your representatives to do something about their fraudulent, deceitful okay? And that's attorneys advising them, okay? That is deceit. The comptroller has told them to return money. They're still holding it to this day. So when our government is committing fraud and they're participating with our private donors that control the market, free market, well, they lose their authority and standing, quite frankly. So we really need to have a proper redress of these grievances. So if
I just wanted to hop in and say thank you so much sincerely for sharing that. We do not have time for our panelists to respond, unfortunately, but we will have a community conversation following the event. I welcome everyone to continue the dialogue that we're having here. Thank you so much for being here, and let's give another round of applause for our panelists. So as I said, that will bring us to the close of our formal programming. I welcome you in the exhibition hall for a sales and book signing of Shane's book, The Affordable City. Invite you to enjoy dessert and some thoughtful community conversations. Let's keep the dialogue going. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Good job, everyone.